What if the most dangerous thing a woman could do was make herself easy to become? Quiet enough, precise enough, predictable enough that someone who had known her entire life could simply slip into the space she occupied and begin wearing it like a coat? Mabel Ashton had spent 11 years building a name worth stealing. She worked as a senior authenticator at Galleria Suerte, one of Miami's oldest auction houses, a place that smelled of climate-controlled air and old lacquered wood and money, arranged so quietly it never needed to announce itself. She was known for three things. She was never late, she was never wrong, and she never raised her voice. Clients sent her champagne at Christmas. Colleagues borrowed her reference books and returned them the same day. Her supervisor, a precise man named Hadley Fern, who dressed like a Victorian and spoke like a contract, had told a board meeting once that Mabel Ashton's eye was worth more to this house than the Flemish oil we just declined to sell. She had folded the compliment into a drawer she never opened. The night everything changed, Mabel stood near the back of the Grand Cortez Hotel ballroom, in a slate blue dress she had pressed herself that morning, holding a leather-bound catalog and watching the room, the way she always watched things, sideways, at an angle. The way you learn to look when looking directly tends to make people perform for you. The gala was a charity fundraiser. The auction piece was a small 18th-century maritime map that had once belonged to a Havana merchant family, and its authentication was hers. She had spent 3 weeks on it. She knew its foxing pattern and the chemical signature of its ink, and the way the vellum had contracted at the edges over 2 centuries of Caribbean humidity. She knew it better than she knew most living people. Her sister arrived at 9:15. Mabel felt her before she saw her. That was the thing about Daphne. She entered rooms the way weather entered rooms, not loudly but completely until the air belonged to her. Daphne Ashton was 2 years younger and had built her entire public life on the precise distance between herself and Mabel. She had a lifestyle channel with 300,000 followers. She wore jewelry in pastel colors and spoke about intentionality and building a life aligned with your authentic self, which Mabel might have found more amusing if Daphne had not spent the better part of a decade borrowing Mabel's clients, Mabel's credentials, Mabel's professional name in conversations Mabel had never been invited to. She had once caught Daphne on a phone call describing herself as working in fine art authentication. When Mabel mentioned it, Daphne had laughed. "Don't be territorial," she'd said. "It's not like you need more credit." That was the word Daphne always used. Credit, as if reputation were a shared account and she had simply been making reasonable withdrawals. Mabel watched her cross the ballroom in a dress the color of fresh cream, greeting people who knew her face from the internet and people who knew Mabel's name from auction catalogs and could not quite reconcile the two. Mabel held her catalog against her ribs. The maritime map hung across the room beneath a brass fixture. It looked, under that light, like it was resting. Prue materialized from the direction of the bar. Priscilla Okafor was Mabel's oldest friend, a contract attorney who appeared at every significant event in Mabel's life carrying 2 drinks without being asked. Tonight she handed Mabel sparkling water. "Don't," she said without preamble. "I'm not doing anything. You're doing that thing where your face goes very still." "My face is always still." "Not like that." Prue watched Daphne pause to embrace someone near the preview table. "What is she doing here?" "She knows the event coordinator." "Of course she does." Prue's voice was even. "She knows everyone who can get her into a room you're already in." That was also true. Mabel finished her water. Hadley Fern was near the front of the room, speaking with donors. The evening was supposed to be simple. Then Daphne came to stand beside her. "Mabel," she said it warmly for the benefit of whoever was nearby, "I didn't know you were working tonight." "I authenticated the piece." Daphne looked toward the map. Her expression shifted by a fraction. Something a stranger might have read as concern. "I heard some talk earlier. One of the collectors was saying the provenance looked irregular." Mabel's fingers tightened around the catalog. "The provenance is sound." "I'm sure you're right." Daphne touched her arm. "I just thought you should know what people are saying, before the auction starts." It happened fast, the way all of Daphne's damage happened fast. Never one blow but a sequence of small, reasonable-sounding statements, each one landing softly and leaving something bruised. The collector Daphne mentioned was real. His name was Beaumont Garza, and within 5 minutes he had gathered 2 other collectors and the director of acquisitions, and was saying in a carrying voice that the Havana map felt off, that he had concerns, that perhaps another expert might want to confirm what Miss Ashton had found. Hadley Fern turned from his donors. The room did not go silent. It was worse than silent. The room continued exactly as before, conversations and champagne and heels on marble, except a small cold pocket had opened around Mabel, and everyone who mattered was aware of it. Daphne stood nearby looking appropriately distressed. She had her hand on Garza's arm and her voice pitched just low enough to seem private and just loud enough to carry. "My sister is brilliant," Daphne said. "She works so hard. But this collection has been a lot of pressure on her, and I worry sometimes that her judgment—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I probably shouldn't say this." The room leaned in without moving. A man's voice came from behind Mabel. "The map is authentic." The voice was unhurried and precise, the way a structural calculation is precise. Not loud, not soft, simply correct in a way that made everything around it feel approximate by comparison. The room adjusted without deciding to. Shoulders straightened. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Beaumont Garza stopped speaking and looked over. Mabel turned. The man standing behind her was not someone she recognized immediately, but she recognized the reaction to him. The way Hadley Fern's chin lifted slightly, the way the director of acquisitions stepped backward by half a step, the way the two men flanking him placed themselves at angles that covered the room without appearing to. He was in his late 30s, dark-haired, in a charcoal suit that looked less like clothing and more like a decision. He was looking at the maritime map, not at Daphne. "I know the Havana merchant family," he said, addressing the room rather than any single person. "I know the collection's history. I verified the provenance independently before this evening." His gaze moved to Garza with the calm flatness of someone who knew the value of everything in the room, including Garza. "The map is authentic. Ms. Ashton's authentication is correct," Daphne said. "And who exactly are you?" He looked at her then, only then. "Someone who doesn't need to introduce himself to answer your question." The silence that followed had a texture. Garza cleared his throat. The director of acquisition said something professional to the group, and the group dispersed the way groups do when they sense the interesting moment is over. Daphne's expression did not change. That was her skill. The face never changed, only the eyes did, and only if you knew where to look. Mabel knew where to look. He walked to where she was standing and stopped 2 feet away. "Are you all right?" he said, at a volume meant for her alone. Mabel looked at the maritime map, 2 centuries old. It had survived everything it had survived. "Yes," she said. "No," he said, not unkindly, just accurately. She looked at him. He had steady dark eyes and the kind of face that had learned not to telegraph anything without deciding to. He did not look at her like a problem. He looked at her like a person who had been given incorrect information and was now correcting it. "Carrick Malone," he said. She had heard the name in pieces. Waterfront holdings, 3 court cases in the last decade that had dissolved at the preliminary stage, a reputation that arrived in rooms before he did. He was described as a developer in newspaper articles and as something harder to name in conversations where people lowered their voices. Mabel Ashton. "I know, he didn't make anything of it. The maritime map is extraordinary, I meant that." She believed him. That was the irritating part. Daphne did not leave well enough alone. Daphne never did. 3 days after the gala, Hadley Fern called Mabel into his office at 8 in the morning, which meant something had happened before he'd finished his coffee, which meant it was serious. He placed his phone on the desk facing her, a formal complaint filed with the auction house's ethics board, signed by Beaumont Garza, alleging that Mabel had authenticated the Havana map without completing the required secondary documentation, had omitted provenance gaps from her written report, and had accessed a client's private acquisition history without authorization. Someone provided Garza with screenshots, Hadley said carefully. The care in his voice meant he did not believe what he was saying, but the board did. Mabel looked at the complaint. The screenshots were real files. The dates on them were wrong. The alterations were subtle enough that only someone who had spent years in the database would catch them, and precise enough to pass initial review. "Someone with system access built these," she said. Hadley looked at her over his reading glasses. "Yes. I need to see the access logs. The board has frozen access pending review." His expression was exactly what she had expected. "Mabel, I need you to take leave until this is resolved." She drove home through March traffic with the windows down, the air warm and salt-smelling, the city moving in its ordinary way while something extraordinary quietly dismantled her work. Her apartment in Coral Gables had white walls and a courtyard bougainvillea that bloomed in a color between fuchsia and argument. The reference library took up one full wall. Her desk faced the window. On its corner sat a small glass paperweight. Suspended inside it, a fragment of coral she had found on a dive when she was 22, the year she first understood that some beautiful things were more durable than they appeared. The apartment had been entered. Nothing thrown, nothing taken, but her reference books had been shifted on the shelf, pulled out and replaced slightly wrong. Her personal authentication notes, kept in the upper left drawer, had been photographed. The camera app on her tablet showed images taken 8 days ago that she had not taken. Her physical backup portfolio had 4 folders replaced in the wrong order. On her bathroom mirror, in her own red grease pencil taken from the drafting cup beside her desk, "He'll see who the real expert is." Mabel stood in the doorway for a long time. Someone had walked through her home like a person taking inventory. She called Prue. She called the police. The police were polite. No forced entry, no theft. Family situations could be complicated. She was advised to change her locks. She looked at Carrick Malone's number, written in the back of the gala's auction catalog, without asking whether she wanted it. She had kept the catalog. She hadn't entirely known why. Now she did. He answered on the second ring. She told him what she'd found in short sentences because her voice was steadier that way. He said, "Don't move anything, I'm sending Jude." Jude arrived in 19 minutes, a quiet man with careful eyes who stood in her doorway until she stepped back, then photographed everything without touching it, and found beneath her desk a tracking device the size of a nickel. "Tracking," he said. He bagged it without bare hands. Mabel sat on the edge of her couch and looked at her own hands. "He asked if you'd like to stay somewhere else tonight," Jude said. "Tell him I'm staying here." Jude nodded like this was a reasonable answer and not the mildly reckless one it was. What they found over the following 4 days was laid out for her in a Brickell conference room. Carrick sat across from her. Jude sat to his left. A woman named Fern, who worked for Carrick's company in a capacity that had no clean job title, opened a laptop and began. The auction house database had been infiltrated 6 weeks ago through a third-party vendor credential. A consulting firm whose only client of record was a marketing company whose sole registered contact was a woman named Daphne Ashton. The forged screenshots had been created using Mabel's own work files, altered with professional software, and sent from an email address differing from Mabel's by 1 character. The tracking device had been bought with a prepaid card used at a Coconut Grove cafe. The cafe's camera had captured the buyer. Daphne Ashton, sunglasses and a linen hat, paying cash. Mabel looked at the photograph for a long time. "This is not the first time," she said. Carrick said nothing. "The gallery show in Wynwood last year, where they pulled my consulting credit from the catalog. The Peralta estate referral that ended with them calling Daphne instead of calling me back. The client in Coral Springs who said my sister had told him I wasn't taking new work." She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. "She has been doing this for years. Slowly, carefully. I kept restarting." Fern closed the laptop. Carrick had not moved. "What do you want to do?" he said. The question felt like the most important one she had been asked in years. Not because it was complicated, because no one else had asked it. Not the police, not Hadley, not even Prue, who had asked and then answered for her. "I want her to say it," Mabel said, "in a room where it can't be unsaid." Carrick had a property on the bay. One of his legitimate holdings, he said, and she noticed he used that word specifically. A house with floor-to-ceiling glass facing the water, a private dock, a security system Fern described as excessive and correct. The water ran green-gray in the mornings and turned nearly black by evening. Mabel sent Daphne a message from her own phone. "I'm exhausted, you were right. I want to talk before I make any decisions." Daphne answered in 4 minutes, "Come to me." Mabel wrote back, "I need neutral ground. I'll send an address." A pause, then, "Fine." Prue read the exchange over her shoulder and was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then, "You are a terrifying person, and I mean that as a compliment." Carrick was near the window. He turned when Prue spoke. "We'll have audio. Detective Suarez has a warrant." "She won't feel pressure," Mabel said. "She'll feel like she's winning. That's when she stops being careful." Carrick looked at her for a moment. "Blue is the word, if you need me in the room." She looked at him. "I won't." "If you do." "Blue," she agreed. He nodded and went to find Jude. Daphne arrived in a white dress and flat sandals that looked artless and had cost $400. No jewelry except small gold hoops. She had chosen to look like the worried one. Mabel had worn red. She had packed it without fully understanding why, then understood the moment she put it on. She did not need armor. She needed to stop pretending she required a disguise. Daphne came through the front door and stopped when she saw the dress. "Red," she said. "I felt like it," Mabel said. Daphne scanned the room quickly, looking for exits and advantages as she always did. Her eyes settled on Mabel. "You look tired." "I've been suspended from work." "I know." Daphne sat without being invited and arranged her expression into something genuinely sorrowful, which was her best performance and always had been. "Mabel, I've been worried." "Have you?" "You can say you're leaving. I'm not going to celebrate. You're my sister." Mabel sat across from her. Outside, the bay was dark and flat. A boat moved in the distance with its running lights on. "Why did you do it?" Mabel asked. Daphne tilted her head. "I don't know what you mean." "The ethics complaint, the database, the tracking device in my apartment, the grease pencil from my own drafting kit." Daphne laughed once softly. "Mabel, Beaumont Garza didn't question the Havana map on his own. You called him before the gala. Fern found the records." Daphne was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she set down the posture, the softness, the entire arrangement of the worried sister's face. What replaced it was not ugly, it was just tired, the way expensive performances get tired. "You have no proof of any of this," she said. "I have call records, a tracking device with your prints, and a database access trail to a consulting firm you funded." "That can be argued." "It can." Mabel kept her hands loose in her lap. "But it won't need to be, because you're going to tell me yourself." Daphne looked at her. The frustration in her face was, strangely, more honest than anything else she had shown all evening. "Why would I do that?" "Because you think I'm offering you a way out." Something shifted. "Are you?" Mabel said nothing. Daphne leaned forward. The softness was completely gone. "Do you know what it costs," she said, "to be next to you? To watch you sit in your quiet office with your quiet expertise and have people defer to you like you invented knowing things." Her voice was precise and tight and nothing like her usual register. "I built something too, 300,000 people, hotel collaborations. I built all of that. And nobody in our family ever deferred to any of it. Nobody sent champagne. The real thing, finally, underneath everything. You have no idea what it's like to stand next to you and be the loud one." Mabel looked at her sister. She saw the teenager who had borrowed her library card for 2 years without asking. She saw the woman who had spent a decade quietly drawing from the only account she had never opened. She saw all of it and felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not grief, but the particular sadness of a long-held question finally answered. Daphne had not wanted to erase her. She had wanted to become her. The distinction was supposed to make it better. It didn't. "Daphne," Mabel said, "tell me what you did." And Daphne did. It came in pieces and then in sentences and then in something that sounded near the end like relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down feels like surrender even when it is. The database, the ethics complaint, the tracking device, the redirected referrals, the Wynwood catalog credit, the Coral Springs client. 12 separate incidents across 3 years. By the time she finished, the room was very still. Outside, headlights appeared at the end of the private drive. Daphne heard them before she understood them. She looked toward the windows, then at Mabel. "What is this?" she said. The front door opened. Detective Suarez came in first, 2 officers behind her. Jude held the door. Carrick came last, and he walked directly to where Mabel stood without looking at Daphne at all. He looked at Mabel's face. He did not ask if she was all right. He had learned that she would say yes regardless, that the question was better answered by reading the set of her jaw, the stillness of her hands. He said only, "I heard." Detective Suarez read Daphne her rights. Daphne said 3 times that this was a misunderstanding, that she was trying to help, that no one understood the pressure of being overlooked. The officers listened with the patient, professional expression of people who had heard many explanations and were not required to respond to them. At the door, Daphne turned. "You think this makes things equal," she said. Mabel looked at her sister in the white dress under the sweep of police lights, with the bay behind her and the city beyond it, and the whole ordinary world continuing around this one precise moment. "No," Mabel said, "I think this makes things accurate." It was the most exact word she had. Daphne was guided through the door. The auction house reinstated Mabel 3 weeks later. The board processed the forged documents and the access logs and the recording with the efficiency of people who were embarrassed and wanted it done quickly. Hadley Fern called on a Wednesday morning and said her position was available immediately. He paused. He added that the Havana Maritime map had sold at the gala's closing session for $68,000 to a private buyer who had submitted his bid in writing and had not been present at the event. Who was the buyer? Mabel asked. A holding company. The acquisition contact listed was C. Malone. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Hadley. She returned to the office on a Thursday. Her desk was exactly as she had left it. Reference books in order, the paperweight with the coral fragment in its corner. Someone, she suspected Hadley, had placed a small ceramic pot of white orchids on the shelf above the desk. She did not frame the reinstatement letter. She filed it in the upper left drawer and got back to work. He came to see her in late April, unannounced, which she had come to understand was his version of consideration. He didn't call ahead because calling ahead would have given her time to build a reason not to see him. He arrived 20 minutes before closing with 2 takeout containers from a Vietnamese place she had mentioned once in passing and had not realized he'd filed away. They ate on the back steps of the auction house because her office had no visitor chairs, and the conference room smelled of recent argument. The evening was warm, jasmine from the building next door. Traffic moving on Ponce de Leon in its ordinary Friday way. The Havana map, she said. He looked at his food. Good investment. Carrick. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, the expression he wore when he decided to be honest instead of deflecting. It belonged to a Havana merchant family, he said. It should belong to someone who understands what that means. She let the silence sit. The jasmine smelled like something she could almost name. Thank you, she said. Don't. I'm going to. He accepted that. She set her container aside and looked at the jacaranda at the parking lot's edge, dropping purple blossoms onto the asphalt in the low light. I don't know what we are, she said. I know. That doesn't bother you? He was quiet then. I spent 15 years knowing exactly what everything was. People, companies, problems, what they were worth and what to do with them. He looked at the tree. You are the first thing in a long time I don't want to calculate. She turned toward him. He was still looking at the jacaranda, his profile very still. She reached over and put her hand in his. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. Something shifted in him, not dramatically, the way things shifted in the stories people told about men like him, but quietly, the way a room shifts when you finally open the window and real air comes in. She said, I know you were watching that whole time, at the waterfront house, waiting. Yes. It was hard for you. He looked at their hands. It was the hardest thing I have done in a long time. I know. She turned her palm against his. Thank you for waiting. He laced his fingers through hers, carefully, the same carefulness he used for everything that mattered to him, and held on. The jacaranda dropped its blossoms. The city made its noise. Neither of them said anything else for a while, because some things do not need to be authenticated. They simply are.